All right, so let's start with the soft tissues of the thorax now that we have gone through the bony thorax. So let's start with the pulmonary system. And this is your respiratory airways and your lungs. Airways meaning the passages, the tubes that carry the air through your body to the lungs. We think of your airway as beginning just inferior to the larynx, and that is the trachea. So if we look at this cadaver slice here, coming down, so here's the oral cavity, is the pharynx, here's the larynx, and below the larynx you have the trachea. Coming down, you see the trachea branches into what we call the primary bronchi or main stem bronchi. And these are the big tubes that essentially carry air, branches off from the trachea, and carries air to each lung. So the trachea is a open, flexible tube, and it is an open tube because it has these rings of hyaline cartilage. You can see right here. It has rings of hyaline cartilage that hold the tube open. These tracheal rings are closed in the front, so you see right there, that's anterior. And I know that's anterior because on the back of the trachea, the hyaline rings, they make a C. They don't connect. It's not a complete O, it's a C. And this is important because that all your tracheal rings being incomplete rings, that allows the trachea to expand a little bit when you need to take in more air, or contract when you don't need to take in as much air. It also allows, if you have like let's say you have a piece of steak stuck in your airway, it allows for some give so that you could expel that piece of steak back up and hopefully continue breathing and survive. So larynx, trachea, primary bronchi. The primary bronchi branch off of the trachea to serve each lung, right and left. And you have the secondary bronchi that branches off the primary bronchi to serve individual lobes of the lungs. Posterior to the trachea, you have the esophagus. So if you take your hand, you touch your Adam's apple, that is the front of your larynx. So if you bring your hand down a little bit and push in on your throat, you're going to feel your trachea. That's your airway. Behind the trachea, you have the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube that leads from your pharynx down to your stomach. It's part of the digestive system. Whereas the trachea is an open tube. It's held open so you can breathe. The esophagus is a collapsed tube. It's not open. It's a muscular tube that sort of holds itself squeezed shut. And that's good because you don't want stomach acid and the things that you have eaten coming back up. So the esophagus is a collapsed tube and it is behind the trachea. The point at which the trachea divides, or the word bifurcates here is used, the point at which the trachea bifurcates into the primary bronchi is called the carina. If you look, if you were to take, let's see, if we were to draw a line straight down here through the trachea, you could see that the left lung, so this is left, this is right, the left lung branches off at a much more severe angle than the right lung. So this particular anatomy of the trachea and the primary bronchi comes into play a lot in the ordinary life of a speech-language pathologist. And that is because if whatever it is that you're eating or drinking, if that happens to get into your airway, so you have a swallowing disorder, which is something that speech-language pathologists are responsible for managing and treating, and whatever it is that you're eating and drinking, if that slips into your airway, it's going to come down the trachea, and it has two options. It can either take a hard left into the left lung, or it can keep going more in the direction that it's already going and end up in the right lung. Which of these things is it most likely to do? If you were to take a ping pong ball, if you were to drop it down a tube like that, odds are it's not going to hit and take a sharp left. It's probably going to be, not all the time, but on average, it's going to be more likely to take the less sharp angle and end up in the right lung. So that means that if you have a swallowing disorder and you're aspirating food into your lungs, when we use the word aspirate, that means that food, liquids that you're trying to eat and drink are ending up in your lungs inadvertently. If that is happening, it's going to tend to end up in the bottom of the right lung. And if you have food and water and sweet tea and Coke and whatever else it is that you're eating and drinking ending up in the bottom of your right lung, that's going to set you up for a form of pneumonia. So and this is the right lung, lower lobe. So anytime as an SLP, if you're working in a hospital, you open someone's file, you see the words right lower lung pneumonia or right lung lower lobe pneumonia, that's going to send a red flashing warning light going off in your head, because that is the pneumonia that most often presents with someone who is aspirating food into their lungs, someone that has a swallowing disorder, someone that you need to be treating. And if you are treating someone and they end up with right lower lung pneumonia, then you better hope that you've been doing the right thing, taking the correct precautions as much as possible to avoid that, because that is your job, your most important job when working with people with swallowing disorders is to keep them from acquiring aspiration pneumonia. And looking at this image right here, you can see just sort of right healthy lung right here. You can see this is clear. There's not a lot of white stuff, but looking down here at this image, you can see that there's a lot of white stuff at the bottom of this right lung, and that is fluid in the bottom of that lung, indicating that that person has pneumonia in that lung. So we've talked about the trachea, the primary, and the secondary bronchi. And looking at this image here that I love, this shows you, they took they took human lungs out of a cadaver and they filled those lungs with plastic. And then they dissolved all the flesh off of the plastic. So what you're looking at here is all the divisions of the bronchial tree. And you can see that the bronchi divide and divide and divide and get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The left lung, which is smaller than the right lung, has only 14 bronchial tree divisions. The right lung, which is a bit larger and more developed than the left lung, has 28 bronchial tree divisions. And in part, this is because the left lung has to share space with the heart. The left lung is sitting there sort of like this with the heart, sharing space. The right lung has the entire right side of the thorax to fill out. So I've already said this. Primary bronchi serve the lungs. The secondary bronchi branch off of the primary bronchi to serve the individual lobes of the lung. Tertiary bronchi branch off of the secondary bronchi to serve specific sections of each lobe. And the bronchial tree divides and divides and divides, ultimately until you end in what is called the terminal bronchiole. Generally speaking, you have the trachea, and then you have the primary bronchi. And then from there, the first 9 times the bronchial tree divides off of the primary bronchi, those passageways are only for transporting gas, moving air in and out of the environment, moving air in and out from the environment to the lungs and from the lungs to the environment. Your actual respiration, the actual exchange of gases, tends to happen more at the final 7 divisions of the bronchial tree. That is where the alveoli start to show up. And ignore this text here for now. Don't worry about what the difference is between terminal respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, terminal bronchioles. All right? We're not going to worry about that this semester. But what we are going to talk about is that at the end of the bronchial tree, once those divisions, bronchial divisions, keep branching off and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually they get to the point where they are feeding air through what we did define the terminal bronchiole, the last bronchiole, right? Feeding air through the terminal bronchiole into into the alveoli. The alveoli are these tiny sacs full of air that are wrapped up in capillaries, and this is where the actual work of respiration happens. This is where your exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen with your environment actually occurs. You have about 300 million alveoli in a healthy lung. So if you were to take just a human lung and slice a cross section of it, open it up, the surface area of the alveoli you would have exposed in that one cut would be a 10-foot by 24-foot square, would be that much surface area. So the purpose of the alveoli is to give your body as much surface area to interact with the atmosphere. The alveoli themselves are composed of a thin membrane through which oxygen and carbon dioxide can move freely. Surrounding this membrane is a bunch of capillaries, which are your blood supply. Your circulatory system is bringing deoxygenated blood from the body to the capillaries to get rid of carbon dioxide and to gain oxygen. So if we look at this little image right here, so you have deoxygenated blood coming down to the alveoli. Carbon dioxide is moving from the capillaries through the walls of the alveolus to be into the air of the alveoli, alveolar air, and then the alveolar air with that extra CO2 that we need to get rid of is expelled through the respiratory system. That's you expiring. That is you pushing air out. And then when you inspire, you bring in oxygenated air. You bring in air with oxygen. Oxygen is going to move from the alveolar air across the thin membrane into the capillaries to be sent up to the heart, to be pumped out to your body to keep yourself alive. So looking at this image, you see the alveolus wrapped in capillaries. And if we look down here at this cross section, you can see the illustration of the red blood cells dropping off carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide diffusing from the capillaries through the alveolar wall into the alveolar air, while oxygen is diffusing from the alveolar air across the alveolar wall to be picked up by the red blood cells, to be sent to the heart, to be pumped out to the body, to keep you alive. That is your oxygen supply. That is how you gain oxygen from the environment, from the atmosphere, and how you dump off extra carbon dioxide from your body. That's how you get rid of that, also to keep you alive.